Tickets. Tickets, please. Step inside, take a ride upon the Terror Train. All aboard, be fair warned, these rails house fear and pain. Find a seat, don't mind the heat, just pray the lights stay on. Upon these rails, these bloody rails, in darkness lies no dawn. Yes, step inside, come crawl or glide, with us you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Ticket, please. James Ward Kirk Publications presents Terror Train. Episode 106, Illinois.
Welcome aboard. Welcome to my home. I am the disembodied voice, your ghost host, so to speak. Call me welcome to my train. Be you dead, undead, or of the living. Tonight, from the depths of darkness, a single passenger hands over a flight ticket to board my train. His mortal soul now resides here among us as his haunting tale is revealed. A tale of the terrifying consequence of time. Yes, pick a car, any car, and find a permanent seat. Listen as our conductor and orator breathes Jeremy May's soul contribution. Midnight Rendezvous.
Ticket, please. Midnight Rendezvous by Jeremy Mays. "I'm going to have to switch cellular servers," Clint said as he tossed the smartphone onto the passenger seat. "Can you hear me now? My ass. Can't even get service 10 minutes from the interstate." Knowing it was hopeless before he even attempted, Clint reluctantly snatched the phone up again and proceeded to dial his best friend's number. Silence. Dead silence. He threw the phone down. Clint glanced to the clock on the stereo in front of him. The bright orange numbers lit the darkness of his truck cab with eerie artificial light. 11:30. Tim had 30 minutes, actually less than that, when you counted the actual driving time from the side of the road which he was now sitting at to the actual train trestle bridge. Tim had 20 minutes, tops. He had told him to meet up at 11:15, hadn't he? Clint shifted his weight upon the gray carpeted seat of his Dodge truck. He rested his head upon his left arm, propped upon the open window, and ran his fingers through his hair. He glanced at the road in front of him, and quickly shot a stare into his rearview mirror. No lights came, only the darkness of the country roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into nowhere. Clint shook his head and glanced at the clock once more. 11:32. Where the hell was Tim? Of course, it was just like him to show up late. Tim had a habit of wanting to make a grand entrance, even if it was only he and Clint going, and no important people to show off to. Clint always thought this was a little too self-centered of his friend. He didn't ever take into consideration that other people actually existed. Clint watched the clock change to 11:35. Hell with this. He turned the key in the ignition. The 8-cylinder engine of his truck exploded to life. He took one more glance about him. No sign of anything. No one. He cursed softly to himself and threw the truck into drive. He gave it a little too much gas, a little too quickly. Loose gravel flew into the air as his pewter-colored vehicle fish-tailed slightly. Clint recovered and steered his vehicle into the direction of his destination. He took a deep breath and let it out. The butterflies were forming in his stomach again. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it was no use. He was scared. He had every right to be, hadn't he? After all, it wasn't every day you were given the opportunity to meet with a ghost. Well, that's what he was hoping for anyway. At least he thought he was hoping for that. When it finally came down to the actual act of meeting up with the ghost, he wasn't too sure if he wanted to or not. Clint glanced at the clock again. 11:40. He focused back on the twisting country road ahead of him. He thought back. It had all started over a simple story, one in the local newspaper. Local Trestle Bridge boasts its own ghost, read the title of the article. With it being around Halloween, every paper in the area was trying to cash in on the atmosphere. Growing up in the area himself, he had never heard of half the stories that he had read in the papers that week. He knew most of them were made up for simple entertainment purposes. Yet for some reason, Clint was drawn to this story. But after he finished, it wasn't like the others. He had a sense that this story had some sort of legitimacy to it. Enough legitimacy to draw him into further investigation of the alleged ghost. The story was like others he had heard before. The setting and the story changed just slightly. An old trestle bridge in the middle of nowhere, the time of midnight, a phantom train, and a ghost that appeared on the bridge. The usual traditional ghost story or legend usually told around a campfire. Yet this story had a twist, something that made it stand out from the others he had heard throughout his life and read recently in the print of the local papers. The ghost was to ask its witnesses a question. This fact stood out in his mind. Just what kind of question would a ghost ask? And how would a ghost sound exactly? This plagued Clint's curious mind for days after ingesting the story. He had to find out for himself. And so did half the population of the surrounding area. He had driven with his friend Tim to the bridge that Friday, one day after the story premiered in the paper. When they reached the site a few minutes before midnight, the area seemed to be flooded in daylight due to all of the vehicles parked in the hollow. It seemed others who had read the story had to know too. Clint remembered just passing the area by, a little disappointed. 11:45. The next few days for him had been a blur. He actually couldn't remember much of it at all, except for being totally focused on the idea of returning to the bridge, almost drawn to it for some odd reason. He had a feeling that this night would be different than the time before, that no other living soul would be there to interfere. This is what worried him slightly. This is why he wanted to have Tim along. It was always good to visit a ghost with backup, wasn't it? 11:50. Not much time now. He thought about grabbing his cell phone and trying Tim again, but decided against it. It wouldn't matter anyway. If Tim was more than a few miles away, it would be impossible for him to reach the bridge before midnight. Clint was this close. He wasn't going to pass up the opportunity. 11:55. Clint came around the corner of a sharp turn. He tapped his brakes. He was close now, close enough to peer down into the bottoms that housed the bridge. He looked. Darkness. Clint smiled. This was a good sign. A very good sign. He continued down the dirt road, down the winding incline that led to the bridge. The butterflies were flying like mad within the confinements of his stomach. He could feel his hands beginning to shake upon his steering wheel. He couldn't believe his luck. No one else was around. He wished Tim could have been there. Clint slowed the big truck to a crawl as he entered the area of the bottoms. His headlights shone brightly through the fog that had settled in the low area. At first, he couldn't make out much, except for the trees and the road itself. Then his headlights hit something that caused them to reflect back into the cab of his truck. Metal. Before him, seeming to jump out of the fog, was the old trestle bridge. Clint felt a lump in his throat at the side of the structure. He had seen it before, several times actually, the crisscross of wooden planks rising into the sky. The metal tracks spanning the trestle and disappearing around the wooded bend. Yet this time, in the dark, without other cars surrounding it, he felt a little uneasy about the whole situation. He began to have second thoughts. He began to wonder whether or not he should turn around and wait for Tim, wait for another time. Clint felt the sense of dread overwhelm him, and for a moment he stopped his truck. He began to put the vehicle into reverse. Clint caught himself. Wasn't this what he wanted? Hadn't he waited for this moment for days? Sure, he was a little scared, but that was natural. He wasn't going to let a little fright spoil what he had to do, what he needed to do. He had to get to that bridge. He wasn't sure why, but he felt as if it was required of him to accomplish this task. Instead of putting the vehicle into reverse, Clint found park instead. He opened the driver's side door and put one foot out upon the gravel surface. There was a chill to the night air, very common for early November weather of southern Illinois. Clint let out his breath and watched the clouds steam from his mouth and fly into the night sky. He watched it progress upward. Clouds blanketed the moon and stars from view making the night seem darker than usual. Not even a star twinkled above. Clint reached back into the cab of the Dodge and pulled out his flashlight. He turned it on and pointed it forward. The beam reflected upon the same surface his headlights had. The bridge. Clint began his trek forward. 11:58. Each step echoed off the surface of the road and bounced off the surrounding woods into the night air. This noise made him feel alone, totally isolated from any other living thing. 11:59. The surface beneath his feet changed. He was no longer walking on the road, but upon the crest of the hill towards the metal bars and wood of the bridge. He glanced back at his truck. Even though it was but a distance of a few yards, to Clint, it seemed a world away. He turned back to his focal point, the reason for being out there, the bridge. There was no turning back. He took a step forward upon its surface. 12 o'clock. As his foot encountered the mixture of iron and wood, Clint felt a sensation he had never encountered before. Suddenly, he felt dizzy, extremely dizzy. The world about him seemed to spin so fast that the earth itself would be thrown from its axis and plummet off into space. Clint felt the need to vomit. He extended his arms like a tightrope walker, trying to do whatever he could to regain his balance. Then he felt another sensation, one that numbed the uncomfortable feeling he had, the consciousness of eyes upon him. Clint raised his head. A bright light blinded him. He brought his arm up to shield his face. He was startled. It had been completely dark a minute ago. He was confused where the light had come from, or what exactly was causing it. He waited a few seconds, trying to let his eyes get as accustomed to the light as possible. Then he lowered his arm. Before him stood two figures. Both gave off an eerie glow that illuminated the borders of their bodies. It appeared as if the light was shining from behind them to cast them in silhouette. Clint squinted his eyes, trying to make out some sort of features of who or what was standing before him. He tilted his head a little and stared at the spectral vision. Clint suddenly realized that the light behind the two figures was coming from the headlights of a vehicle parked down the road below. Clint could see that now, but why hadn't he noticed it when he stopped his truck? Was he that focused on the bridge not to notice? He turned his gaze to the strangers before him, his eyes more adjusted to his surroundings. He could make out their faces now. Two people, one female and one male. Both of them had their eyes transfixed upon him, wide open, jaws dropped open. What were they staring at? "Brian, look!" "I know, Denise, I see it." Their voices were muffled, almost as if Clint was hearing them speak from underwater. He glared at them confused, not sure what to say or how to respond. They kept staring. "What do we do?" the girl asked. The boy went silent. "Brian!" she hissed in a desperate whisper. Again, the boy was silent. Clint was confused. "Who are you guys?" It was not more than a mere second before the two strangers turned to flee back towards their vehicle. Clint raised an arm, trying to signal them to stop, but it was useless. Neither one of them turned their eyes back in his direction. Clint watched as they jumped into the vehicle that awaited them on the other side of the bridge. Squealing tires filled the night air as the couple tore up the bottom road in reverse. Clint saw the lights of the car change directions at the top of the embankment, and then the red glow of fading taillights. Clint shook his head. "What the hell just happened?" he asked aloud as he turned back towards his truck. He walked slowly, reviewing the events he had just witnessed. He couldn't make light of what had happened. It didn't make sense. He reached his truck, climbed into the cab, and sat down. His eyes drifted toward the stereo clock. 12 o'clock. He leaned forward and tapped the stereo. That couldn't be right. He had been out of the truck for at least 10 minutes. He began to push the buttons on his radio. They responded normally. What was going on? Thoughts suddenly poured through his head. Tim didn't show up. The cell phone didn't work. Him being drawn to the bridge. The clock. The strangers. He had asked the strangers a question, and they had run off as if something had scared them. As if they had just seen a ghost. Clint nearly choked at his realization. A ghost! Memories flooded before his eyes rapidly. He saw his truck, the bottoms, the bridge, and another car trying to cross under the trestle at the same time. He had swerved to the right. An impact. Large beams of wood supporting the weights of trains for decades. Sturdy. Unmovable. Clint threw his head back upon the headrest. He couldn't remember anything else. Everything remained a blur. He looked back down to his clock radio. 12 o'clock. It had happened then. 12 o'clock. Tears began to form in his eyes as he began to decipher his situation. Those people, the strangers, had run because they had seen what they had come to see. A ghost with a question. Clint covered his eyes and began to cry. After a few moments, he raised his head, ready to deal with what lay before him. But something strange had happened. He still sat in his truck, but his truck no longer sat in the same place. He looked about him. His vehicle was parked on the side of the road, the place he had been waiting for Tim just minutes before. He glanced to his clock. 11:30. He almost laughed. His hands fell to his sides, his right one bumping something on the passenger seat. He glanced over and saw his cell phone. He started to reach for it, but then laughed some more. He knew it wouldn't work. So, this was how it was going to be, doomed to repeat the same night over and over again. Doomed to become the questioning ghost that he had sought to find. He watched the stereo clock change. 11:35. Hell with this, he said, realizing that phrase sounded all too familiar. He reached for the key and turned his truck on. It exploded to life. He smiled as he threw the gear shift into drive. He would accept his fate. What other choice had he? Besides, he had a purpose now. They would come. They would come from all around now to see the famous ghost of the Trestle Bridge and wait to hear what questions he would ask. Maybe with the right questions and their answers, he could come to an understanding of what had actually happened to him. Then he could somehow make sense out of all of this. Maybe. Clint sped down the familiar country road. He had the urge to look up into the night sky, but he chose not to, knowing it was covered in clouds. No moon, no stars, just darkness. Besides, he didn't have time for that now. He had an appointment to make. A 12 o'clock appointment.
Yes, our guests have taken their permanent seats. From New York to time infinite. Are you ready to join them? Perhaps another story will lure you. Choose a car, any car. For the time we had a permanent guest, as they tell their tales of horror at its best. Come, yes, join me. My name is Terror, who rides the rails eternally upon the Terror Train.
Survived this trek? No turning back. Dare resist, just try. Step back inside, we'll be your guide. So many ways to die. Upon this ride, nowhere to hide. With us, you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Terror Train Podcast, Episode 106, Illinois. Produced by Krista Clark Grabowski, David Schutz II, and Mary Genevieve Fortier. Podcast directed and arranged by David Schutz II. The conductor, or narrator, was created by and played by David Schutz II. Terror, the disembodied voice, was created by and played by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Terror Train Podcast opening and closing poems, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Host segment dialogue for Terror, the disembodied voice, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Production music, The House of Leaves, Chase Pulse, The Hive, and The Voices by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Featured work, Midnight Rendezvous, written by Jeremy Mays. Production music, Echoes of Time, Dark Walk, Ghost Story, excerpt from Long Note 4, Gathering Darkness, One of Them, Unnatural Situation, and Quinn's song, A New Man, by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Additional sound effects by AudioSoundClips.com. Podcast program edited by David Schutz II. The stories and poems presented in the Terror Train podcasts are all featured in the James Ward Kirk Publishing Anthology, Terror Train, which was edited by Krista Clark Grabowski and A. Henry Keene. Cover art by Stephen Cooney. Content copyright 2014. Terror Train, Podcast Episode 106, Illinois. Copyright 2014.